me walking backwards as you talk. So how long have you known Helen Bullis?
How long have been going actually? I can't remember. I've been involved with them. Well, it's not Jan's fault. She's great when I met her.
Yes.
That's 18, 19 years ago. So.
And you know Sal Perry, don't you?
Yeah, I do,
Yeah. So I used to live next door but one to Sal.
Oh, right.
And Helen lived just round the corner.
Of course. Is that Birkby?
Yes.
Birkby, yeah. Yeah. Oh.
So you can't highly recommend. No pressure.
We're very good
Really
friends.
mean.
Yeah.
Really mean.
I've got
2.
2 and 1. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
It's lovely to see you on the first of our Lent Life. So we've got 3 of these panel discussions. So tonight we are thinking about environment, but do put in your diary inclusion next Tuesday, and I'm afraid we had to reschedule Huddersfield. Huddersfield won't be happening on the 29th of April, but on the 29th of March, but on the 5th of April, we've got a cracking lineup for poverty and justice. So do make sure that you put those in your diary. They're going to be well worth coming to. So I'm going to introduce Bishop Jonathan. Bishop Jonathan is Bishop of Huddersfield. He's very kindly agreed to facilitate this evening. You're very welcome. Please interact. Please ask questions. The panel are fab and they've got great things to tell you, but interact with them. Use them while they're here. And a very, very warm welcome from everybody at St. Peter's.
Thank you, Amanda, very much indeed. And it's a great pleasure for me to be back here at St. Peter's and to be sharing in this panel discussion this evening. It's a topic that is dear to my heart. I was saying to one of the panellists, my own doctoral research was on our human responsibility for, yes, our fellow human beings, but also for the created world. And that was back in the 1980s. So things have moved on a long way since then, and these concerns are much more central to all of us and to our world. I'm sure we're also very mindful this evening of all that's going on in the world, the tragedy of what's unfolding in Ukraine, and the impact of that on the people of that nation.
It comes out in sections, has nailed it. And Antonio Guterres, who's the Secretary General of the UN, said, "This is code red for humanity." We have no time to start to fix this. We have to start to fix this crisis now. This decade, we have to turn things round. We have almost no carbon budget left if we are to stay within 1.5 degrees heating, and if we go beyond that, the risks become escalatingly enormous and catastrophic. And it's not just about climate change. We're also, we've got species extinction, we're losing biodiversity at a fantastic rate. So this is humanity pushing against all of the planetary boundaries. And we've known this for a long time. The first IPCC report was in 1990. And yet since then, we've had rising emissions, increasing extinctions. And what's interesting to do is to look back and see when this kind of kicked off. And if you look at all of the graphs of human activity, economic activity and energy use and carbon dioxide emissions, you'll see that they kick up around 1950 like that. And most of the carbon dioxide emissions that are causing the global warming that we're starting to see coming on train now has been emitted since 1950. And for me that's quite pertinent because I was actually born in 1952. So it's one lifetime that we've really created this crisis. And that gives me a little tiny bit of hope, because if we can do it in one lifetime, surely we can turn this round. And I think hope's really interesting, because if you look at the science, it's pretty hard to have hope. You know, the kind of what we've got to do to get there is so enormous. And yet we need hope. We don't live without hope, none of us. So we have to cultivate hope through whatever spiritual tradition or whatever way we can find. And then the sort of question is, what can we do? And I think a quote from Piers Forster, who's Professor of Physical Climate Science at Leeds University, lead author on the IPCC report, and he said 4 years ago, we have to do everything and we have to do it immediately. That was 4 years ago, and we haven't. And we have to see this, I think, as the difference in first aid and treatment. So we have to stop carbon dioxide emissions, we've got to keep fossil fuels in the ground, we've got to do all the things that many of us have read about, change our diet. All those things are very important, but they are first aid. So when we have an accident, we probably hemorrhage blood and we've injured ourselves. First thing, stop the blood, saves the life, but it doesn't treat the person and make them well again. And this will not treat the where we are and make us well again. And I think that where we've come to as our scientific revolution, technological revolution, we have lost the connection to nature. And if you look at indigenous peoples, and I think that very much reflects how we were in the past, humanity, we had a very strong spiritual bond to the natural world, to the web of life, which I think we have lost in this technological revolution. It may go back to the Greeks or whatever. I think if we don't refine that as a species, then it will be very hard for us to heal and truly heal this world. Thank you.
Fantastic. Chris, thank you very much indeed for that challenge to us and for keeping wonderfully to time.
I'm amazed. I'm amazed. I didn't think I could do that.
That was great. Thank you very much. Chailey Collis, I'm delighted to introduce. Chailey is the coordinator of Huddersfield Friends of the Earth, which campaigns on a range of local and national issues, from trying to stop Kirklees Council's road expansion plans to lobbying MPs and government about support for new fossil fuel projects, such as the Cumbrian coal mine. Chailey is also very involved in the fossil-free West Yorkshire campaign, trying to get the West Yorkshire Pension Fund to divest from fossil fuels, and also promotes low-energy building as coordinator of the Zero Carbon Yorkshire Buildings Group. Chailey, welcome to you, and over to you.
Thank you. I've done some hastily scrawled notes, so I was hoping I could sort of wing it, but I'm glad I followed Chris because he's very eloquently outlined the situation we're in, and I think, just as Greta Thunberg said, you know, we have to behave like our house is on fire, because it is. And we all need to be in emergency mode, the way we behave, the way we react to it. And it's really hard because there's sort of media silence about climate. And so we're fighting that all the time. So I suppose that's my immediate perspective, is we need to act like it's an emergency. And that's why, you know, people like groups like XR are doing what they're doing. And so Friends of the...
It's very difficult
to hear. I've got a radio mic on. Is that any better?
Yeah, it is on.
I'll do my best to... sorry, I have got a ridiculously quiet voice. Okay, I'll project. So, yeah, I think, as Jonathan said, what Friends of the Earth is doing, I think our focus is the decision makers, the people who've got power, whoever they are. I include fossil fuel industry in that. They have got enormous amount of power, and we need to take that power from them, really, which is why I'm really keen on divestment from fossil fuels. So Friends of the Earth focuses on our local and national politicians and making a noise, we try and make a noise, because if enough people made a noise, they would act. And we see that politicians do act if there's enough noise. And unfortunately, there isn't enough noise about climate, so we really need to be making a noise. And I'll just outline some of the campaigns we're working on. One of them, a very concerning one, is the policing bill, which the government is about to bring in, which is going to make protests really difficult. Even Friends of the Earth protests, you know, we're not breaking, we don't think we're breaking the law, but we might be breaking the law by accident with this new legislation. So I would really urge you to sort of become aware of the policing bill and lobby your MP about the policing bill and join Friends of the Earth, and we can help you do that. So, and other campaigns we're working on are trying to get Kirklees Council to implement a climate action plan, which we've been waiting 3 years for them to do.
One of the biggest economic driving factors in the district. Our turnover last year, I think, was £173 million. We've got 14,500 students, 2,500 staff. It's a big place. We've also got a ever-increasing campus, as you've all seen. That presents quite a bit of a challenge for myself in the fact that we're trying to reduce the carbon footprint of the university whilst we're also making it bigger. That leads to a couple of aspects, one of them being the emissions from our operations. So, you know, trying to look at how we can decarbonise what we actually do now, but also look to what we're actually going to construct in the future, because we are going to construct, we're going to keep growing, and how can we minimise or reduce as best as we can the carbon footprint from it. And it's a challenge. We need to look at our supply chain, what we do, how we purchase. There's been a big sea change in the last few years of my career of looking at that and looking at actually what our impact is. I mean, Charlie's mentioned the divestment of investment in fossil fuels. Thankfully, that's an area the university hadn't made with our own investments, but obviously we're a member of the West Yorkshire Pension Fund, so we have some responsibility there as well. But also, it's how we construct our buildings, how we operate them, how we design them to be more adaptable for the future. And that's just our estate. That's not taking account of all the people within it. And I think Charlie and Chris have kind of much more eloquently put about the impacts of kind of what we're facing in terms of the climate emergency. But I think one thing that's quite important for myself, especially working in an educational institution, is the fact that climate change is a very inequitable problem. There's two aspects of that. One of them is young people are going to feel its effects for a lot longer than we are. I'm just coming up on 40 years old, and in my lifetime, I've been knowing about things like the Kyoto Agreement and various conferences in Rio and the various communities of practice meetings that have been going on in the UN for most of my adult life and for my formative years. We've now got a student body coming through who traditionally at the university were not that interested and not that engaged. We've now got students come through who've known about this their entire life and known about the impact and heard about the dialogue and are engaged and are cognizant of the fact it's going to affect them. The other aspect as well, and this is where it comes into things like supply chain, is incredibly important, is that the climate emergency is affecting developing nations a lot more than developed nations. Not in the fact that we're not having effects ourselves. We've got things like multiple storms. With much more. We're having 1 in 1,000 year climate events every few years at the moment. But what we're able to do is be more financially resilient to cope with it. Whereas, you look at some of the impacts in developing nations and they just can't afford to deal with it. Rising sea levels are going to affect a country like Bangladesh a hell of a lot more than we are, when the vast majority of their country is below sea level. So we've got a lot we can look at as an institution. but even then we're only a microcosm. You know, we're not. You know, we're only a sort of mid-sized university. You know, like I said, our turnover was 173 million. Oxford's last year was 4 billion. You know, they have a vastly bigger impact than we have. And again, that's one institution out of 130 in this country. That's just the higher education sector. When you roll that out, you look at universities, colleges, NHS hospitals, councils, even churches, dioceses throughout the country. Just in this country, we've all got a massive challenge, and we're all working out how on earth we can actually achieve these net zero targets we've got, while also be mindful of the fact that we need to implement and maintain science-based targets to keep our direct emissions below 1.5 as best as we can. Because the one aspect of net zero targets is okay, if you can't reduce your own direct emissions, you're going to have to offset them. Is there going to be enough offsets for everybody? Probably not. So there's a huge amount of work and a huge change in the way that we approach this thing that needs to happen over the next few years to actually achieve these things. So I think kind of me.
Patrick, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. And we're hearing things, it's really interesting. We're hearing things from different perspectives and hearing some of the practical challenges coming out there as well. So, Debbie, over to you. Delighted to introduce Debbie, who is no stranger to me or indeed to St. Peter's. Debbie tells me she learned her birds, trees, butterflies and wildflowers on Sunday morning nature walks with her father and sister, which means you weren't in church on a Sunday morning. There's a thought. That's where we are. Wildlife has always been important to her, and two fine biology teachers later, as a result of whose influence, she studied zoology at Oxford. At the age of 14, she met God while in a rowing boat on the Norfolk Broads and met Jesus while a sixth former. She's married, has one son, both musicians, which is her other great passion. After teaching biology and then full-time church ministry for about 30 years, Debbie retired here to Huddersfield, spends her time on her allotment, volunteering with Yorkshire Wildlife Trust and helping in several local churches. She's a Franciscan, a green and area environmental champion for the Huddersfield Episcopal area. Debbie, welcome to you and over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. I don't need to give my introduction because it's almost word for word what Chris and Shaylee were talking about describing the situation of planet Earth and how the COP conferences have been logging the increased temperature and how we're missing the Sustainable Development Goals. I was fake news wherever it needs calling out. And some of us, like Satish Kumar, will find that by tending our soil, we will learn the art of tending our soul and through it of tending society. And tonight can be a start of that journey.
Fantastic. Debbie, thank you very much indeed. Each of our speakers has given us a different perspective. Lots of things to think about. Can we express our thanks to them, please, before we open up to questions? Thank you so much. Really stimulating. Lovely to hear these different voices. Lots of overlapping themes too. What we'd like to do now is open up the conversation to the whole assembled body here, and then you can direct a comment perhaps to an individual if you want to, but otherwise we'll have won't necessarily have all four voices each time there's a comment, but comments and questions. If I can invite you to keep any comments brief and your questions clear. Who'd like to start the ball rolling? Hang on, you're going to bring you a microphone.
Yeah, I'm Richard. Thank you very much.
Richard, could you turn the hat on the mic up, please, Charlie? Is it as high as it'll go? Pretty much.
It's all right. Yep, it's okay.
Yeah, so I'm Richard. Thank you very much for this. I've got two young children. I've got a 10-year-old and a five-year-old. And I'm a believer that we're not too late and that God and Jesus gives us hope eternally. But when my children ask me what their future's going to be like, I don't know, and it's more scarier than when I was a child back in early 80s. And I can't give them any certainty, but I can give them hope, so that's what I do. But my question is, you mentioned that Kirklees won't implement climate emergency plan. Why?
Well, shall I? Yeah, they've just kicked it down the road. It's like they say it's coming, but they've kicked it down the road. So we're trying to keep the pressure on all the time, but that's why we go every time to the council meeting. I think it is that they say it's coming, but it's not there yet. So
Chris?
Sorry, I wasn't interrupting.
No, please, you probably know more.
Well, so Kirklees, I agree with you. I've got an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old grandsons, so I feel the same, and at my greater age, and seeing these young people and their, excitement of the world, and knowing what's possibly facing them. It's heartbreaking in some ways, and I did have something in my talk, but there wasn't time, so just mentioning them. I like to mention. I'm also a Kirklees Climate Commissioner now, so Kirklees set up, so they declared the climate emergency 3 years ago. That's right, isn't it? Sorry, I lose track of time, it's so long. To be fair to Kirklees, obviously they set up a working party to produce a report, which took nearly a year. So they waited for the report. I was involved with the report. I was one of the official observers and wrote a bit of some of the content about buildings. So that reported in December 2019. One of the recommendations was to set up a climate commission. So there are climate commissions in Leeds and in other local authorities. There's Yorkshire and Humber one as well, charged with trying to address this issue across the whole area. But they didn't set it up, and we have to be fair to them. COVID came, and they were a bit distracted by what they had to do. But that didn't get set up for another year. So the Climate Commission was set up last year, and I volunteered to be a commissioner. And it's one of those things where the Climate Commission is trying to work out what it's for and what it's trying to do. But I think Kirklees would say, and I hope I'm being fair to them, that that was their big commitment, to set up the Climate Commission. And then obviously they would say that they're doing a lot in their own sort of estate, if you like, with their electric vehicles and all that sort of stuff. But it's an emergency. And we saw how the council and the government responded to emergency like COVID. We can see how government is responding to Ukraine, which is, a true emergency. I mean, it's heartbreaking, it's a tragedy. But we don't see that level of action in either local authority or central government. With this crisis, which is a bigger crisis ultimately, it's just slow motion. It's a slow motion crash. So that's by way of information as much as anything, I'm afraid.
Okay.
If that's helpful. Sorry? I'm sorry.
Richard's saying it doesn't feel like an emergency,
Yes,
and I think that's
yes.
one of the challenges, isn't it? When it's there on your television screens, what we're seeing in Ukraine, that looks like an emergency. On the other hand, if we haven't felt the emergency through much of the coverage, not least, yes, someone mentioned Richard Attenborough earlier on, and so on. But the difficulty is to keep it up to the top of the agenda, and that's a challenge for all of us. Who'd like to come back with another comment or question? Sue.
I live in Honley, and there's housing shooting up everywhere around where we live. There's absolutely no sign of the developers putting solar panels on. There's no sign that the houses are any better insulated than the bare minimum. I just think that it's time developers were forced to build sustainably. I think that's one of the key issues, and I don't see it because I suspect that they're into making a profit, all to give to their rich shareholders.
Okay. Chris, this is really your area of expertise, I think, but I'm going to also, in a minute then, Patrick, look to you and say, what's the university doing when it's building all these buildings? How is it handling some of those issues? But Chris.
Right, I'm going to have to be careful here because obviously I can talk about this for an hour or so.
It's all right, I'll stop you.
So please stop me, and I will self-discipline myself. It's all right. Yes, you're quite right. New buildings are very poorly built, with some of the worst in Northern Europe, in this country, generally, the building regulations. So they're controlled by building regulations, Part L of the building regulations, which covers energy efficiency. We've got an upkick in June coming, which is supposed to increase. They always talk about improvements over a certain baseline rather than the actual performance of the building. So it's a 30% improvement. It's supposed to be coming in June. However, we know that most buildings don't meet the building regulations. There is what's called a performance gap between the way they're designed and how they actually perform, which I won't go into because that would be start the hour lecture. So we know that. We also know how to build good buildings because the passive house movement has shown there's no magic in it. It's just good building science.
In our industry, if we want to implement things like air source heat pumps and all those kind of sides of things and more renewable energy, we don't have enough people who are trained up to do it. We've got quite a lot of gas appliance engineers, but we don't have enough heat pump engineers, and they're two very different items. So, climb with my horse. In terms of what we're trying to do at the university, so we are kind of been going through an incremental process of improvement every time we do a new construction project, and it's a lot about learning from what we've done previously. And each project is getting better, but again, as Chris said, there's a performance gap. We are trying to close that as much as we can. We'd love a new set of building regs to come through because we can use that in terms of contractual obligations, but what I would say is that we specify our buildings way beyond what building regulations are at the moment. We're not at passive house level, but we can't, unfortunately, economics, we can't afford to do some of the projects at the scale that we do to those standards. But again, we're doing things like improving air tightness levels in construction projects. One of the best things we do is we employ what are known as NEC supervisors, which is it doesn't matter what NEC stands for, but basically what these people are is they go around and they check the work. So effectively like a clerk of works, normal job, but they're not just checking the actual physical implementation, and they are also checking the designs and they're checking the specifications as we're going along to make sure it actually meets what we need. And that is some of the best investment we do in our buildings, is employing people from outside the university, but to act on our behalf to check things as we're going, to make sure it's done right. And we've seen improvement through that, but we've got a long way to go still.
Okay, Patrick, thank you very much indeed. I think Debbie wanted to come in.
I'm interested in what could be done in the time until the new building regs come through. And I know I hear a lot about retrofitting existing properties in the meantime to make them fit for purpose. And also, I think that's similar to what Insulate Britain have been asking for. I wondered if the two of you had any comments to make that.
Let's give Chalia.
Okay, well, I do also have a building hat, so I've kind of, Chris and I worked together all the time, but
Sorry, it's not a stitch up.
just
Amanda didn't know.
coincidentally. Yeah, retrofit is, obviously it's easier to build new build, it's cheaper. So the best thing is to build passive house to start with, because you don't have to retrofit it later. But yeah, retrofit, you can use the passive house methodology to retrofit and to and apparently, some countries are, I don't know the ins and outs of it, but like Italy heavily subsidises retrofit for its population, and it's perfectly possible to have a government-funded retrofit strategy, and there are campaigns for that, aren't there, too? There's the National Retrofit Strategy campaign that Green Building Source supports, and yeah, it would stimulate the economy in lots of ways as well, and also help us reduce our dependence on Russian or, you know, gas as well, which is a sort of added bonus as well. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Chris, anything you want to add?
Again, I don't want to give a lecture. Exactly. Very interesting, just seen an example. Well, I've been involved with Insulate Britain, not gluing myself to the road just because I'm a coward, I think, but I got involved in running some webinars for the industry to try and, I suppose, so Insulate Britain could be seen to be supporting the industry as well as direct action. And I lost my thread there saying that. Sorry. Apologies. One of the interesting things that we've heard recently is that Ireland now have a very comprehensive retrofit programme. So they're rolling out a really ambitious programme to start retrofitting houses in Ireland. And really, it's very intelligent the way they're doing it. It would be lovely to bring those lessons into the UK. We had a meeting with the advisor to the minister who's responsible in Ireland, and he said he'd be more than happy to advise them, but they have to ask him. You know, you can't just approach the civil service here. And the government has been wrestling with retrofit for a number of years. It's been wrestling with the Green Deal. It's a right mess, and fundamentally you need long-term investment. Did you want to contribute to this?
Yes,
I'll shut up.
I'm not quite sure what happens when you come along and retrofit a house. What would visibly change in my little terrace house if you came along and retrofitted it to make it? Because I'm really not quite sure what you would do or how my house would change and if my bills would suddenly go up or suddenly go down if you come and retrofit it.
How would it impact an average house?
What would you do?
What would you do?
Yeah, sorry, because I'm a little bit deaf. Yeah. Oh my gosh. In 2 minutes. Well, basically you need to insulate it, you need to make it more airtight, and then you need to think about ventilation. Those are the simple things, if you like. Fundamentally, what you have to do to any building to make it more energy efficient is to deal with those things. You've got to insulate, and that, I'm sure, is no surprise to you. You've got to deal with airtightness, because there's a very simple example. If you wear a nice thick woolly jumper, and you're lovely and warm because you're well insulated, and you go out in the wind and it just, you're totally uncomfortable, it blows straight through it. So you need an airtight layer. So you put a Gore-Tex on, effectively. Houses need that too. Most of our houses are incredibly leaky. And so you want to make them airtight, you want to insulate them. You do need to deal with something that's called thermal bridges, which means where bits go through the insulation and remove some of the effect, and possibly therefore you get mould growing. So you would insulate the building, you'd make it more airtight, and then you would probably introduce a ventilation system, because at the moment how you ventilate the building is the wind blowing through the walls, effectively. Maybe a fan in the bathroom if you're lucky. So if you've got a terrace house, you can put the insulation on the outside or the inside. If you can't put it on the outside, which I'm guessing is probably quite likely in Yorkshire terrace houses, mine is, then you put it on the inside. You have to do it carefully because you have to understand what you're doing, because you can introduce problems into the building, start getting a lot of moisture in the walls, but basically you do that. And at the same time, you make it more airtight, usually by putting a coating on the wall as you put the insulation on, sort of thing. Then when you've made it more airtight...
Sitting really. I think I would just say there's Centre for Alternative Technology did a very good study called Zero Carbon Britain, and they actually modelled how we could be self-sufficient with energy, and it included energy efficiency but also renewables. So it's totally possible. We don't need fossil fuels. We can do it. That study shows, but the political will really is the issue. I don't know if anyone else wants to say.
Deb?
Yes, I've recently been reading a book called The Future We Choose by Christiana Figueres and Tom Rivett-Carnac, who were involved in the Paris COP back in 2015. And one of the things they do in that book, talking about futures that are destructive and futures that are constructive for humanity and the planet, is to talk about attitudes. And one of them ties in with what Richard said earlier, because he was talking about hope. and their version of that is stubborn optimism. And what it's actually saying is that hope isn't something gooey or a nice feeling. Hope is a radical kind of discipline to say it is possible. And those of us who are Christians know that hope is about knowing that even when you're in the middle of Good Friday, that Easter Day is going to happen. And that's very much like what we're talking about with climate change. But the other, one of the other attitudes that they talk about in that chapter is called endless abundance. And they say, why are we talking about this stuff which is running out, which is all this fossilized carbon, when there's virtually an endless abundance of anything that comes from the sun's energy, which includes wind and wave as well as solar. And so all of our energy should be put into it, and that solar and wind are already cheaper per unit in our land than fossil fuels. So why on earth haven't we moved over to them? Because they are actually cheaper energy.
Thank you very much. We've got time probably for one more round of one more question and one more round of comments. Who'd like to come in on what we're hearing and talking about? Yeah.
The question might not quite be fair, I don't know, because I'm not sure we've got economists on the panel, but it strikes me...
Can you speak up a bit?
Sorry, yeah, the question is really, the theme that's sort of underlying a lot of comments this evening has been one of economics and affordability, and I wonder if the panel have a view on what we can do to help put pressure on to change the economic structures that underlie our reliance on fossil fuels and the way that we live and do things these days, and what can we help to change those structures and bring about a more just and sustainable society in that way.
Okay, that's a very big question. I think what I'm going to do, because I'm going to ask each of the panellists to give us their response to that question, and that would be a very good way to wrap up the discussion. So, Chris, can I come to you first?
Right, okay. Well, I think you said none of us are economists, so we'll speak from complete ignorance, but or at least I will anyway, claim to. I mean, the first thing, obviously, to bear in mind that we've had in the West, we've had it's pretty dominant across the world, a neoliberal ideology that's taken hold and replaced our more mixed economic mode since late 70s. But I mean, that's gestating from Hayek in whenever it was 50s. So. That has been very destructive in my view, and has been one of the things that's led us to this perhaps greater level of crisis than otherwise we would be at. What you do with that I don't know, other than replace our politicians. So I won't go any further with that one because I don't know what you do about that. But I found it a tragedy. But in terms of the current economic system, the evidence is that there is a huge amount of money to invest in the right stuff. And basically, investment in the wrong stuff is becoming increasingly difficult, if you like. People are worried about stranded assets, investing in fossil fuels, investing in anything that really doesn't have a future. And the markets and the equity markets are beginning to understand this, and the fossil fuel divestment campaigns and all of that. So if that can be released, then there is a lot of money. And in my mind, and what we see evidence of, is that once you start releasing that, by releasing state funding goes into pump prime, it does start releasing equity. And I mean, Chaley was mentioning the Italian example, going back to retrofit, they are funding 110% of retrofits, 110, not 100%, so that they enable that, all the enabling works as well. So people will retrofit their houses and they'll come out, it's all covered. Now that will eventually create a market where equity will want to start investing in retrofit. But you've got to give the confidence, you've got to build the skills, you've got to build the industry. We can't retrofit at the moment because we don't have the skills, we don't have any of it. You've got to build that. I have a colleague who sometimes gives seminars on exactly this subject, And he said, you know, the markets are sloshing with money to invest. There is no shortage of money, you know, and we're talking billions and billions and billions. It's pension fund money or whatever. So that's my bit of an answer to it, and I'll hand over.
That was a good answer, Chris. Much better than mine. I would just say there's a couple of things. Friends of the Earth have got a campaign at the moment for a windfall tax on fossil fuel companies that are raking it in at the moment with the bill to help subsidise, you know, the fuel bill rises and stuff like that. So there's a Friends of the Earth campaign about that at the moment. I think I can't give you facts and figures on this, but I'm fairly sure the UK government still subsidises fossil fuel industry. It's still giving them tax breaks, and so that would be a good way.
That's how individual companies are positioning themselves for the transition to a low-carbon economy through a public, transparent online tool. The TPI is backed by 62 funds with over $18 trillion of combined assets under management or assets under advice. Listen to this. The TPI is co-chaired by the Church of England Pensions Board and the Environment Agency Pension Fund in partnership with others. The Church of England has been playing a leading role through its pension fund in the establishment of the Transition Pathway Initiative, and it is one of the major levers on where those corporations are putting their money. We're already seeing people disinvesting in Russia at the moment. If we can use our influence, we can also bring that to bear to ensure that money, and it will be money in the end that drives this, is put where we believe it ought to be. We need to change the narrative. We need a narrative of change and a narrative of hope. Huge thanks to our panellists, to all of you. Can we express our thanks to them again this evening? Thank you so much.
Can I also say a big thank you to Bishop Jonathan for facilitating so fabulously. So thank you to Bishop Jonathan as well. We still do have some time. We've got coffee, we've got tea, and we've got an opportunity